The cruelest thing a man can do isn't cheating on you. It's making you believe you were never enough to be chosen. Claire Bennett didn't cry when she saw the engagement announcement. Not at first. She just sat there frozen on the edge of her tiny Brooklyn apartment couch, one hand still wrapped around a mug of cold coffee, while the glow from her laptop painted the room in pale blue light. Outside, rain tapped softly against the fire escape. Somewhere downstairs, a siren echoed through the wet Manhattan streets. But inside Claire's apartment, the world had gone completely silent. On the screen, Ethan Callaway smiled for the cameras beneath a chandelier worth more than Claire's yearly rent. Forbes called it the business engagement of the year. Billionaire tech founder Ethan Callaway proposes to socialite Vanessa Bennett during the annual Callaway Foundation Gala. Claire stared at the live stream as applause exploded through the ballroom. Champagne glasses lifted into the air. Flashbulbs burst like fireworks. Vanessa's diamond ring caught the light so brightly it almost hurt to look at. Then Ethan took Vanessa's hand and kissed it gently while reporters shouted questions from below the stage. Claire felt her stomach tighten so hard she thought she might get sick. Because she knew that ring. God, she knew it. 2 years ago, Ethan had sketched that exact design on a napkin while they were eating greasy dollar pizza at 2 in the morning. No giant diamond. He had told her back then, laughing softly as she sat cross-legged beside him on the floor of his tiny startup office. You deserve something elegant. Something timeless. Claire remembered teasing him about it. Bold of you to assume I'd marry you. Ethan had looked up from the sketch with tired eyes and that crooked smile she used to love more than anything. You already picked out my future, Claire. I'm just trying to catch up to it. Her chest ached at the memory now. On screen, Vanessa lifted her left hand toward the cameras, showing off the ring that had once belonged to another future. Claire finally exhaled shakily and closed the laptop halfway, but not all the way. She hated herself for still looking. Hated herself even more for hoping Ethan's expression might reveal hesitation, regret, anything. But he looked perfect standing beside her sister. Tailored tuxedo. $1 billion smile. The golden couple America had decided to worship. Vanessa looked beautiful too. Of course she did. Vanessa had always looked beautiful. Even as little girls growing up in Connecticut, people used to stop and stare at her. Teachers remembered Vanessa first. Boys noticed Vanessa first. Their mother introduced Vanessa first. Meanwhile, Claire became an expert at standing quietly in the background, smiling politely, while someone else absorbed all the light in the room. She told herself years ago that it didn't bother her anymore. Then Ethan came into her life. And for the first time, someone chose her first. Or at least she thought he did. Claire stood up slowly and walked toward the kitchen sink, gripping the counter until her knuckles turned white. The apartment suddenly felt too small, too warm. She could still hear Ethan's voice in her head from years ago, back before private jets and magazine covers and investors turned him into a man the world couldn't stop watching. Back when he was just a burned-out founder surviving on caffeine and impossible dreams. Back when he used to sleep in hoodies instead of custom suits. Claire had met him at 26, during the worst winter of her life. He was broke, exhausted. Half his employees had quit. Investors were pulling out. She remembered finding him alone outside a deli at 1:30 in the morning while snow fell across the sidewalk. He had looked completely lost, staring at his phone like the weight of the entire world was crushing him. You okay? She had asked carefully. Ethan laughed once under his breath. Not even a little. That should have been the beginning of a short conversation between strangers. Instead, it became the beginning of everything. Claire believed in him before Forbes did. Before Wall Street did. Before his company became worth billions. She stayed up editing pitch decks beside him until sunrise. She talked him through panic attacks nobody else knew about. She celebrated tiny victories with takeout Chinese food and cheap wine from the corner store. Ethan once told her she made failure feel less terrifying. When I'm with you, he whispered one night while resting his forehead against hers, I don't feel like I'm drowning anymore. Claire had believed him. God, she believed every word. The sound of her phone vibrating against the counter snapped her out of the memory. She glanced down and saw her mother's name flashing across the screen. Claire didn't answer immediately. She already knew what the call would sound like. Her mother would pretend this engagement had happened naturally, gracefully, like it wasn't strange that one sister dated a billionaire for 3 years only to watch him propose to the other one on national television. The phone kept buzzing. Finally, Claire answered quietly. Hi, Mom. Her mother hesitated only half a second. Honey, did you see the news? Claire closed her eyes. In the distance, thunder rolled over the city. Yeah, she whispered. I saw it. Claire barely slept that night. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Vanessa smiling beneath the ballroom lights while Ethan slid the ring onto her finger like the last 3 years had never happened. Around 4:30 in the morning, she finally gave up trying to rest and wandered toward the narrow kitchen of her apartment wearing an oversized gray sweatshirt and wool socks that no longer matched. The city outside her window was still dark, rain streaking softly across the glass. She turned on the coffee machine and leaned both hands against the counter while memories she had spent months trying to bury came flooding back anyway. Before Ethan became the billionaire everyone wanted a piece of, he had been living inside a cramped one-bedroom apartment above a laundromat in Queens. The ceiling leaked whenever it rained hard. The radiator worked only when it felt like it. Half the time the place smelled faintly like detergent and burnt toast. Claire remembered laughing the first time she climbed those crooked stairs carrying 2 grocery bags because Ethan had forgotten to eat again. This is not exactly the glamorous tech founder lifestyle I imagined, she teased gently after stepping over a pile of tangled charging cables near the couch. Ethan looked up from his laptop with dark circles under his eyes and gave her a tired smile. You mean billion-dollar empires are not usually built beside a broken washing machine? Back then, nobody called him visionary. Nobody invited him onto magazine covers or business panels. Investors ignored his emails. Former classmates treated his company like a joke. Claire still remembered one investor dinner in Manhattan where Ethan spent 20 straight minutes pitching his software platform only for a man in a navy suit to interrupt him halfway through and ask if he had considered shutting the company down before losing more money. Claire had watched Ethan's jaw tighten while humiliation flickered across his face for just 1 second before he forced himself to stay calm. Later that night, they sat together on the subway heading back to Queens while exhausted commuters swayed around them beneath flickering fluorescent lights. Ethan stared down at his hands the entire ride. Maybe they are right, he finally admitted quietly. Maybe I am just embarrassing myself at this point. Claire turned toward him immediately. Do not say that. He laughed bitterly under his breath. Claire, my own employees are quitting. Because they are scared. Maybe they are realistic. No, she said firmly. They just cannot see what you see yet. Ethan looked at her then. Really looked at her. Like he was trying to understand why she still believed in him when the rest of the world clearly did not. Claire remembered reaching over and squeezing his hand softly as the train rattled beneath the East River. You are going to make this work someday, she whispered. And when you do, I hope you still remember who you were before everybody started clapping for you. For a moment, Ethan said nothing. Then he lifted her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles gently beneath the ugly subway lighting like she was the only peaceful thing left in his collapsing world. Claire closed her eyes now as the memory hit her harder than she expected. Because she missed that version of him most. Not the billionaire standing under crystal chandeliers. Not the polished, public figure investors worshipped. She missed the exhausted man who used to fall asleep on her shoulder while spreadsheets glowed across his laptop screen at 3 in the morning. The man who once admitted he was terrified of becoming cold. A sharp knock on the apartment door startled her. Claire glanced toward the clock on the microwave. 7:12 in the morning. Too early for visitors. She opened the door cautiously and froze when she saw Vanessa standing in the hallway wearing oversized sunglasses and a cream-colored cashmere coat that probably cost more than Claire's monthly paycheck. Even at sunrise, Vanessa looked flawless. Can I come in? Claire stepped aside silently. Vanessa walked into the apartment slowly, glancing around at the tiny kitchen and secondhand furniture with an expression Claire could never quite read. Pity maybe, or discomfort. Claire crossed her arms tightly. You should probably be busy celebrating right now. Vanessa removed her sunglasses carefully. Claire, do not. Her voice cracked before she could stop it. Vanessa sighed softly and set her designer purse on the counter. I did not come here to fight. Claire laughed once under her breath. That is funny because it feels a little late for that. Silence filled the apartment. Somewhere outside, a garbage truck groaned down the street. Vanessa finally looked at her carefully. I never planned for this to happen. Claire stared at her sister in disbelief. You did not plan for what? Falling in love with my boyfriend. Vanessa looked away first. That hurt more than if she had defended herself. Claire felt her chest tighten painfully. How long? She asked quietly. Vanessa hesitated. It was not like that at first. Claire nodded slowly, even though tears were beginning to burn behind her eyes. That means it happened slowly enough for both of you to stop it. Vanessa swallowed hard, but said nothing. And somehow that silence told Claire everything she needed to know. Claire did not realize she was crying until Vanessa handed her a napkin from the kitchen counter, and she saw mascara stains on her fingertips. She wiped her face quickly, embarrassed by the tears even now. Vanessa stood quietly across from her, perfectly composed in her cream-colored coat, while the early morning light slowly crept through the apartment windows. For a moment, Claire hated how effortless her sister always looked. Even guilt looked elegant on Vanessa Bennett. I never meant to hurt you, Vanessa said softly. Claire let out a hollow laugh. That sentence loses meaning when someone says it after stealing your life. Vanessa flinched slightly. Good. Claire wanted her to feel uncomfortable. She wanted someone besides herself to finally sit inside the damage for once. Do you love him? Claire asked suddenly. Vanessa hesitated just long enough to hurt her. I care about him. Claire looked away toward the rain-covered window because somehow that answer felt worse than hearing yes. That is not what I asked. Silence stretched between them again. Then Vanessa sighed quietly and sat down at the small kitchen table where Ethan used to eat takeout noodles at midnight while complaining about investors and software bugs. Claire almost told her to get up from that chair. Instead, she stayed frozen beside the counter. You know what the difference is between you and me? Vanessa asked carefully. Claire crossed her arms tighter. Please enlighten me. You loved Ethan when he had nothing. Claire stared at her sister in disbelief. And apparently that was my mistake. Vanessa shook her head immediately. No. Claire, listen to me. You made him feel safe. You made him feel understood. But once everything exploded, she searched for the words carefully. He changed. Claire swallowed hard. People do not accidentally fall in love with their girlfriend's sister because they changed. Vanessa lowered her eyes. You did not see what happened behind the scenes. Claire felt anger rise sharply in her chest. Then explain it to me. Explain how the man who used to beg me not to leave him suddenly started introducing you to reporters instead. Vanessa looked exhausted suddenly. Older somehow. Because everybody around him kept telling him you were temporary. The words landed like a punch straight through Claire's chest. She stared at her sister speechlessly. Vanessa continued. Quietly. Investors. Publicists. His board members. Even his mother. Claire looked away fast, blinking hard. She remembered the first time Margaret Calloway met her at a charity dinner in Manhattan, nearly 2 years ago. Claire had spent an hour choosing a navy dress she could barely afford because Ethan insisted the dinner mattered. The restaurant overlooked Central Park, all gold lighting and crystal glasses and waiters carrying tiny plates of food Claire could not pronounce. She remembered feeling completely out of place the second she walked inside. Ethan squeezed her hand beneath the table at one point and whispered, "You are doing great." But Margaret barely looked at Claire all night. Every question sounded polite while somehow feeling cruel underneath. So what exactly do you do, Claire? Graphic design. Freelance. Mostly. How flexible. Claire remembered smiling tightly while heat crept into her cheeks. Then Vanessa arrived unexpectedly halfway through dessert after flying in from Los Angeles for a modeling campaign. The entire energy of the table changed instantly. Margaret lit up. Investors laughed louder. Ethan looked surprised but impressed watching Vanessa command the room effortlessly in a black satin dress while discussing art auctions and business headlines like she had been born inside their world. Claire remembered shrinking quietly beside her water glass that night. For the first time, she felt invisible standing beside Ethan. Vanessa looked up now, her voice barely above a whisper. After that dinner, Margaret started inviting me to events. She said Ethan needed somebody who could survive the spotlight beside him. Claire laughed bitterly. And you just volunteered? At first I thought I was helping him. And later, Vanessa looked down at the engagement ring on her finger. Claire noticed the diamond seemed colder up close. Later, I think we both crossed lines we should not have crossed. Claire felt tears threatening again, but this time anger burned hotter than grief. Did he ever even defend me? Vanessa stayed silent. That silence answered everything. Claire nodded slowly like she was finally understanding the shape of her own. Heartbreak for the first time. It was never just about Ethan falling for someone else. It was about watching the entire world slowly decide she was not polished enough to stand beside the man she helped build. She thought about all the nights she spent editing presentations while Ethan slept on the couch beside her. All the times she calmed him down before investor meetings. All the tiny sacrifices nobody ever saw because they happened before the cameras arrived. And in the end, none of it mattered once billionaires and boardrooms decided what his future should look like. Vanessa stood slowly from the table. He still talks about you sometimes. Claire's face hardened instantly. Do not do that. I am serious. No. Claire whispered sharply. Do not stand in my apartment wearing my future on your hand and tell me he still thinks about me. Vanessa swallowed hard. Claire. You know the worst part? Claire said quietly. I actually blamed myself for months. I kept wondering what was wrong with me. If I was too boring, too quiet, too small for his world. Her voice trembled slightly now. But the truth is, he let other people decide my value for him. Vanessa's eyes filled with guilt. Claire opened the apartment door without another word. After a long moment, Vanessa nodded faintly and walked toward it. But just before leaving, she stopped beside the doorway and said something that stayed with Claire long after the door closed behind her. For what it is worth, I do not think he ever stopped loving you. After Vanessa left, Claire stood alone in the middle of her apartment for a long time without moving. The silence felt strange now, almost louder after everything her sister had confessed. Rain still slid slowly down the windows while morning traffic hummed far below the building. Her coffee had gone cold hours ago, but she drank it anyway because she needed something bitter to match the ache sitting inside her chest. She kept replaying Vanessa's final words over and over again. I do not think he ever stopped loving you. Claire wanted to hate that sentence. Instead, it hurt in the worst possible way because some small part of her still wanted it to be true. Around noon, her phone buzzed again. This time, Ethan's name lit up the screen. Claire froze instantly. Just seeing his name made her stomach tighten. Ethan Calloway. There was a time when that name meant comfort to her. Safety. Home. Now it felt dangerous. The phone rang once. Twice. 3 times. Claire stared at it until the call finally ended. A second later, another notification appeared. Ethan, please talk to me. Claire laughed softly under her breath, but there was no humor in it. Talk now? After months of silence? After a public engagement broadcast across the entire country? Her thumb hovered over the screen before she finally locked the phone and tossed it onto the couch. She could not do this today. Maybe not ever. She walked toward her bedroom instead, needing distraction more than anything else. But halfway through opening the closet, her eyes landed on a familiar black storage box shoved onto the top shelf. Claire stared at it for several seconds before slowly pulling it down. Dust coated the lid slightly. She had not opened it in almost a year. Not since the breakup. Her hands trembled a little as she lifted the cover. Inside was the entire history of a relationship the world no longer acknowledged. Old movie tickets. Polaroids. Notes Ethan used to leave inside her coat pocket before investor meetings. A faded subway card. A tiny silver keychain shaped like a rocket ship from the first version of Ethan's software launch. Claire picked up a folded piece of paper carefully. The edges were worn soft from being opened too many times. Her chest tightened immediately when she recognized Ethan's handwriting. One day when all of this becomes real, I am buying you a bookstore cafe by the ocean because you deserve mornings that feel peaceful. Love, E. Claire closed her eyes hard. God, he used to love her so openly back then, before fame taught him how to perform love for cameras instead. Another memory surfaced before she could stop it. 2 summers earlier. Montauk. Ethan had rented the cheapest beach motel he could find because his company was still bleeding money and they could barely afford the trip. The air conditioner barely worked. The wallpaper looked older than both of them combined. But Claire remembered laughing harder that weekend than she had in years. One night, they walked barefoot along the beach carrying gas station sandwiches and a 6-pack of soda because neither of them had money for the expensive restaurants nearby. The sky turned orange over the Atlantic while cold waves crashed against their ankles. Ethan wrapped an old hoodie around her shoulders because the wind had picked up. Promise me something, he said suddenly while staring out toward the water. Claire looked up at him. What? If this company fails, he smiled faintly. Do not let me become one of those bitter rich guys who thinks money fixes loneliness. Claire laughed softly. You are not rich. Exactly. That is why I still have a chance. She nudged his shoulder gently. You are not going to turn into a terrible person, Ethan. He looked at her for a long moment, then reached out, brushing windblown hair behind her ear carefully. You say that now. Claire opened her eyes slowly back in the apartment, her chest aching under the weight of memory. Because somewhere along the way, he had become exactly the man he feared. Her phone buzzed again across the couch. Another message from Ethan. Ethan, I know I do not deserve it, but please let me explain. Claire stared at the words while anger and grief twisted together inside her. Explain what exactly? How success slowly erased her from his life. How he let people treat her like she was temporary until eventually he believed it too. Before she could stop herself, she typed back. Claire, did you love her before or after you stopped loving me? The typing bubble appeared instantly, then disappeared, then appeared again. Claire's heart pounded painfully while she waited. Finally, his reply came through. Ethan, I never stopped loving you. Claire felt tears sting her eyes immediately. She hated how fast those words still affected her. Hated that some part of her still knew exactly how his voice would sound saying them. But then another memory hit her hard. 6 months ago, the exact moment something inside her finally broke. Ethan had invited her to a private investor party in Manhattan after weeks of barely seeing him. Claire spent nearly an hour getting ready, even though exhaustion sat heavy beneath her skin. She remembered arriving at the rooftop venue and instantly feeling underdressed compared to the women surrounding Ethan. Models, influencers, women who moved through billionaire conversations like they belonged there. Claire spotted Ethan near the bar laughing beside Vanessa beneath hanging gold lights. And for one terrible second, they looked perfect together. Then she heard one of the investors chuckle quietly beside her. Interesting upgrade, the man said. Claire turned slowly. Excuse me. He nodded casually toward Vanessa. The sister fits him better. Better image. Better connections. Better everything, honestly. Claire waited for Ethan to correct him. To defend her. To say something. Anything. But Ethan only looked down at his drink in silence. And that silence had destroyed her long before the engagement ever did. Claire did not answer Ethan after that. She stared at his message until the words blurred together, then quietly turned her phone face down on the couch beside her. Outside, the rain had finally stopped, but the sky over Brooklyn still looked heavy and gray, like the city itself was exhausted. She walked slowly toward the bedroom and sat on the edge of the mattress, surrounded by pieces of a life that suddenly no longer made sense. Somewhere between loving Ethan and losing him, Claire had stopped recognizing herself. The worst part was not even the betrayal anymore. It was realizing how small she had become trying to fit inside his new world. She remembered the beginning of the change so clearly now. At first, success looked harmless. Exciting, even. Ethan's company finally landed a major investor. Then another. Suddenly, he was flying to San Francisco twice a month. Journalists wanted interviews. Podcasts invited him on as the young genius founder transforming the tech industry. Claire had been proud of him. God, she had been so proud. She still remembered dancing barefoot in Ethan's apartment after his company officially crossed its first $100 million valuation. Ethan picked her up and spun her around the tiny kitchen while music blasted from an old speaker beside the sink. We made it, he whispered against her hair, laughing breathlessly. We. Back then, he still said we. But over time, the word quietly disappeared. Claire noticed it in little ways first. Ethan started canceling dinner plans because investors suddenly needed him. His assistant began scheduling every hour of his life. Publicists coached him on interviews. Stylists changed the way he dressed. Even his apartment changed. The old Queen's Place vanished, replaced by a sleek penthouse overlooking Central Park where everything looked expensive and untouched. Claire remembered standing inside it for the first time, feeling strangely nervous. The marble counters were spotless. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked Manhattan like something out of a movie. Ethan wrapped his arms around her from behind while she stared silently at the skyline. You hate it, he teased softly. No, Claire whispered. It just does not feel like you yet. Ethan kissed her forehead gently. Maybe I'm still figuring out who that is. But soon other people started figuring it out for him. Claire saw it happen slowly, ruthlessly. His publicist suggested she wear brighter colors to events because neutral tones looked forgettable on camera. One investor's wife asked if Claire had ever considered reinventing herself now that Ethan was becoming high profile. Another woman smiled politely at a gala before saying, You are lucky he still likes simple girls. Claire smiled through every insult because she loved Ethan more than her own pride back then. But every event chipped away at her confidence piece by piece. Then Vanessa moved back to New York permanently. Suddenly, everything became easier for Ethan. Vanessa understood luxury dinners and charity auctions. She knew exactly how to speak to reporters. She could walk into any ballroom, wearing designer gowns, and instantly belong there in ways Claire never did. Claire tried not to resent her sister at first. She even convinced herself they were all just adapting to Ethan's new life together. But deep down, she already felt the shift happening. She remembered one particular night, almost 8 months before the engagement. Ethan hosted a private launch party for one of his company's biggest software deals. The rooftop venue overlooked the Hudson River, glowing gold beneath strings of hanging lights, while servers carried trays of champagne through crowds dressed in black tie fashion. Claire spent nearly 3 hours getting ready alone in the penthouse bathroom because she wanted to feel beautiful beside him again. When she finally stepped into the ballroom wearing a dark green satin dress she had saved for months to buy, Ethan looked up from across the room and smiled warmly at her. For 1 second, everything felt normal again. Then Vanessa arrived. Heads turned instantly. Reporters rushed toward her beside the entrance. Cameras flashed across the room. Ethan's investors greeted her by name before she even reached the bar. Claire watched the entire room reorganize itself around her sister's presence like gravity had shifted. At some point during the evening, Claire wandered onto the balcony needing air. Cold wind swept across the river below, while Manhattan glittered in the distance. She heard voices near the partially open terrace door behind her and froze when she realized Ethan was speaking with 2 board members. "Vanessa is incredible for your image," one man said casually. "People love the power couple angle." Another laughed softly. Honestly, Claire never looked permanent anyway. Claire's stomach dropped instantly. She waited for Ethan to shut the conversation down, to defend her. Instead, there was only silence, long enough to break her heart completely. Finally, Ethan spoke quietly. "This conversation is inappropriate." But even then, his voice lacked conviction, like a man too tired to fight the direction his life was moving. Claire slipped away from the balcony before anyone saw her crying. She locked herself inside the penthouse bathroom afterward and stared at her reflection under bright, white lights for almost 10 minutes. Her makeup looked perfect. Her hair looked perfect. But suddenly none of it mattered because she understood something painful for the first time. She was trying to compete in a world where she had already been quietly replaced. Back in the present, Claire wrapped her arms around herself tightly as that memory settled over her again. Her phone buzzed one more time on the couch across the room. Another message from Ethan. "Ethan, please let me see you." Claire stared at the words from across the apartment. Then slowly, for the first time in months, something colder than heartbreak settled inside her chest. Clarity. Claire did not answer Ethan that day, or the next one. By the 3rd morning, his messages had become less polished and more desperate, which somehow made them harder to ignore. "Ethan, I know I hurt you. Ethan, please just let me explain everything in person. Ethan, I am outside." Claire stared at the final message while her heartbeat immediately sped up. She walked carefully toward the apartment window and pulled the curtain aside just enough to peek down at the street below. A black town car sat parked beside the curb beneath the fading gray sky. Ethan leaned against it wearing a dark wool coat with his hands shoved into his pockets while cold wind moved through his hair. Even from 4 floors up, Claire recognized the exhaustion in his posture instantly. He looked thinner than she remembered. Tired. Human again somehow. Her chest tightened painfully at the sight of him. For a dangerous second, she almost ran downstairs without thinking. Muscle memory. Love memory. But then another image flashed through her mind. Ethan standing beside Vanessa beneath ballroom lights while the entire world applauded their future together. Claire stepped away from the window immediately. 10 minutes later, another message arrived. "Ethan, I am not leaving until you talk to me." Claire laughed softly under her breath, because of course he would say that. Ethan had always believed persistence could solve everything. Business problems, investor crises, failing software launches. But heartbreak was different. Some things broke quietly and never returned to what they were before. Still, by early evening, she finally gave in. Maybe because she needed closure. Maybe because part of her still wanted to hear him say something that could make sense of the last year. Claire grabbed her coat and headed downstairs before she could change her mind. The moment Ethan saw her step outside the building, something raw flickered across his face. Relief mixed with guilt. He straightened immediately, taking one hesitant step toward her. Claire. God. Hearing him say her name out loud again nearly shattered her resolve. His voice still sounded exactly the same. Warm. Familiar. Dangerous. Claire crossed her arms tightly against the cold February air. You have 5 minutes. Ethan swallowed hard. Up close, she could see exhaustion carved beneath his eyes like he had not slept properly in days. Thank you for coming down. Do not waste the time apologizing, Claire said quietly. I already know you are sorry. Ethan stared at her for a moment before looking away toward the street. You look tired, he murmured softly. Claire almost laughed at the absurdity of that observation. I watched my ex-boyfriend propose to my sister on national television, Ethan. Sleep has not exactly been a priority. Pain flashed visibly across his face. Good. Claire wanted him uncomfortable. She wanted him to sit inside the consequences he spent months avoiding. Ethan exhaled slowly into the cold air. I never wanted things to happen this way. Claire shook her head immediately. That sentence means nothing anymore. Claire. No. Her voice cracked sharper than intended. You do not get to stand here acting confused about how this happened. You let this happen. Ethan looked down silently. The city moved around them in blurred headlights and distant sirens while cold wind swept down the block. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Ethan finally said the one thing she had feared hearing most. I was drowning. Claire stared at him in disbelief. Ethan rubbed a hand across his jaw tiredly. Everything got bigger so fast. Investors, media, expectations. Every room I walked into felt like people were measuring me constantly, watching for weakness. He laughed bitterly under his breath. And somewhere along the way, I started believing them when they said love had to look a certain way besides success. Claire felt tears burn behind her eyes immediately. So you chose Vanessa because she looked better in photographs? No, Ethan stepped closer instinctively. God, Claire, it was never that simple. Then explain it to me, she whispered painfully. Because from where I am standing, it really looks that simple. Ethan looked wrecked now. Truly wrecked. You were the only real thing in my life for years, he admitted quietly. And I think that terrified me more than losing money ever did. Claire blinked at him, stunned by the honesty in his voice. Ethan continued softly, almost like confessing something ugly about himself. Every time someone criticized you, every time they implied you did not belong beside me, I should have defended you. His jaw tightened. Instead, I stayed quiet because part of me was scared they were right. The words hit harder than Claire expected because they confirmed the one fear she had spent months trying to silence. Ethan saw tears fill her eyes and instantly looked devastated. Claire, do you know what that did to me? She whispered. Watching the man I loved slowly become embarrassed of me? I was never embarrassed of you. Then why did you let me disappear? Ethan had no answer, and that silence told her everything all over again. Claire looked away quickly, trying to steady her breathing. Across the street, headlights reflected off wet pavement while strangers passed by, without noticing the quiet destruction unfolding between two people who once planned an entire future together. Ethan spoke again after a long moment, his voice rough now. I ended the engagement this morning. Claire froze completely. Slowly, she turned back toward him. What? Ethan's eyes stayed locked on hers. Vanessa gave the ring back. Claire's heartbeat stumbled painfully. You are lying. I am not. Ethan looked exhausted saying it. There is no wedding anymore. Claire stared at him speechlessly while cold wind moved between them. Somewhere deep inside her chest, old hope threatened to wake up again. And that terrified her more than anything. Claire felt the world tilt slightly beneath her feet. The cold New York air suddenly seemed thinner, harder to breathe through. No wedding anymore. The words echoed inside her chest while Ethan stood silently in front of her, his expression exhausted and painfully sincere. For a dangerous second, Claire imagined what would happen if she stepped forward right now. If she let herself fall back into his arms the way she used to after long nights and impossible days. She could almost remember exactly how his heartbeat sounded beneath her cheek. Almost. But then reality settled back over her like ice water. Ethan had still chosen her sister once. Publicly. Completely. Claire folded her arms tighter around herself. Why? She asked quietly. Ethan blinked. Why what? Why end it now? Her voice trembled despite her effort to steady it. You already made your choice. Ethan looked down at the wet pavement for a moment before answering. Because I realized I was building a life that looked successful while destroying the only thing that ever made me feel human. Claire closed her eyes briefly. God. He always knew exactly how to say the things that reached straight into her heart. That had always been part of the problem. Ethan stepped closer carefully, like he was afraid she might disappear if he moved too fast. I know I do not deserve another chance, he admitted softly. I know I broke something between us. Claire laughed bitterly under her breath. Something? Pain flickered across his face immediately. Everything, he corrected quietly. The honesty in his voice made her chest ache again. Ethan looked exhausted now in a way Claire had never seen before. Not even during the early startup years when he survived on caffeine and panic attacks. Back then he had been overwhelmed. This felt different. Hollow somehow. Like success had finally cost him something he could not replace. Vanessa ended it too, Ethan said after a long silence. Claire stared at him carefully. What does that mean? Ethan rubbed a hand across the back of his neck tiredly. After the gala, she asked me if I was actually in love with her. Claire's stomach tightened painfully. Ethan let out a humorless laugh, and I could not answer her fast enough. Claire looked away immediately because hearing that hurt in ways she could not explain. She told me she was tired of feeling like she was standing inside someone else's love story. Ethan's voice dropped quieter. She was right. Wind swept down the street between them while headlights blurred across wet asphalt nearby. Claire tried to process everything, but emotions kept colliding too fast inside her chest. Anger, grief, relief, shame for still loving him after all of this. Ethan reached into the pocket of his coat slowly. I need to show you something. Claire instantly stiffened. Ethan, please. His voice cracked slightly. Just this. He pulled out a folded piece of paper worn soft around the edges. Claire recognized it immediately before he even unfolded it. The old sketch. Her breath caught painfully in her throat. 2 years ago, she had designed the original branding concept for Ethan's company sitting cross-legged on his apartment floor while cheap takeout containers surrounded them. Ethan had kept every version of her sketches from those early days because he claimed they reminded him what mattered. Now he carefully handed one back to her beneath the dim streetlights. Claire stared down at the paper silently. Her own handwriting curved along the bottom corner beside tiny coffee stains and rough pencil marks. Ethan watched her carefully. I kept this in my desk the entire time, he said softly. Even after everything fell apart. Claire swallowed hard, fighting tears again. Why? Ethan's expression broke completely then. Because every good thing in my life started with you. God. Claire hated how badly she wanted to believe him. Ethan stepped closer again, his voice rough with emotion now. Claire, I know I failed you. I know I let people into my head until I became someone neither of us recognized anymore. His eyes searched hers desperately. But losing you finally forced me to see what all this success actually turned me into. Claire looked down at the sketch, trembling slightly in her hands. Somewhere nearby, a cab horn echoed through traffic while cold wind lifted strands of hair across her face. Ethan reached out instinctively like he wanted to brush them back the way he used to, but stopped himself halfway there. The hesitation hurt almost more than if he had touched her. I loved you when I had nothing, he whispered. And somehow I convinced myself I needed someone different once I had everything. Claire finally looked up at him then, tears shining in her eyes. Do you know what the cruelest part is? She asked quietly. Ethan stayed silent. Claire's voice shook now despite every effort to control it. I would have stayed through all of it. She laughed softly through tears. The pressure, the investors, the chaos. I would have fought for you anyway. Ethan looked devastated hearing that. I know, but you stopped fighting for me. Silence fell heavily between them. Ethan opened his mouth like he wanted to say something else, but Claire suddenly took one step backward, then another. Ethan's face changed instantly. Panic. Claire. She shook her head gently, tears slipping down her cheeks now. I cannot do this tonight. Please do not walk away again. God. The fear in his voice nearly destroyed her. Claire pressed trembling fingers against her lips briefly before lowering them again. You broke my trust, Ethan, she whispered painfully. And love does not magically erase that just because you finally realized what you lost. Ethan stood frozen beneath the streetlights while heartbreak flickered openly across his face. For the first time in years, Claire saw the old version of him again. Not the billionaire, not the polished public figure, just a man terrified of losing the only person who ever loved him before the world told him who to become. Claire stepped backward once more toward her apartment building entrance. "I do not know if I can survive loving you twice," she admitted quietly. Then before he could stop her, she turned and disappeared back inside. The next few weeks passed in a strange quiet that Claire did not know how to explain. Ethan stopped showing up outside her apartment after that night, but his absence somehow felt louder than his presence ever had. Sometimes she caught herself looking toward the street anyway, while making coffee in the morning, half expecting to see the Blacktown car parked outside again. Other times she hated herself for missing him at all. New York slowly moved towards spring, while Claire tried to rebuild the parts of herself she had abandoned during the last year of their relationship. She worked longer hours, took freelance design projects she normally would have turned down, started spending weekends at small bookstores and coffee shops again, instead of hiding inside her apartment replaying old memories. Little by little, she began remembering who she had been before loving Ethan became the center of her entire emotional universe. Then one Tuesday afternoon, everything changed again. Claire sat inside a crowded cafe in Soho reviewing logo drafts for a local skincare brand when her best friend Natalie suddenly slid into the chair across from her looking breathless. "Why is Ethan Callaway trending on every business website right now?" Claire's stomach tightened instantly. "I do not know." Natalie pulled out her phone quickly. "Apparently, he resigned from 3 major investor boards this morning." Claire blinked in confusion. "What?" Natalie scrolled rapidly through headlines. "People are freaking out because he also canceled the Callaway Foundation expansion project." Claire frowned slightly. None of that sounded like Ethan. He built his life around growth and expansion and impossible ambition. Walking away from power voluntarily felt almost unrecognizable coming from him. Natalie looked up carefully. "Claire, there are rumors." "About what?" Natalie hesitated. "That the engagement fallout messed him up pretty badly." Claire immediately looked away toward the cafe window. She did not want to hear this. Did not want the dangerous softness inside her chest waking up again. Natalie studied her quietly for a moment. "You still love him." Claire laughed under her breath, without humor. "That is the problem." Later that evening, Claire found herself unable to focus on work. Ethan's face kept replaying in her mind from the last time she saw him standing beneath the streetlights looking completely shattered after she walked away. Finally, frustrated with herself, she opened her laptop intending to distract her thoughts with emails instead. Instead, she froze when she saw an unread message sitting at the top of her inbox. From Ethan. Sent 3 days earlier. Claire stared at it for nearly a full minute before opening it slowly. There was no subject line, just a single paragraph. "I spent years building a life impressive enough to earn respect from people who never cared about me as a person. Somewhere along the way, I traded peace for applause and convinced myself that was success. Then I lost the one person who loved me before any of this existed. I know I do not deserve forgiveness, but I needed you to know something. Every version of me that was worth loving began with you." Claire closed her eyes tightly after reading it. Her chest ached in that familiar, dangerous way again. God, Ethan had always known how to reach the parts of her heart she tried hardest to protect. She almost closed the laptop without responding. Almost. But then another message appeared beneath the first one. An attachment. Curious despite herself, Claire clicked it open. Her breath caught instantly. It was a photograph of the old sketch she designed for Ethan's company years ago taped inside what looked like a new office space. But this time there was more. Large presentation boards filled the room. Branding concepts. Interior mock-ups. Her handwriting everywhere. Claire frowned in confusion before noticing the final image attached underneath. A storefront in Brooklyn with paper covering the windows and a small sign hanging on the door. Bennett Creative Studio, opening soon. Claire stared at the screen speechlessly. 30 minutes later, she found herself standing outside the address listed in the photo while cool evening wind moved through the street. The neighborhood was quieter than Manhattan. Tree-lined sidewalks. Brick storefronts. Warm yellow lights glowing through nearby windows. Claire walked slowly toward the building with her heartbeat pounding harder with every step. The paper still covered most of the windows, but through one corner she could see partially assembled desks and design boards inside. Her design boards. Claire's hand trembled slightly as she reached for the locked front door. I was hoping you would come. Ethan's voice behind her nearly stopped her heart. Claire turned sharply. He stood a few feet away, wearing a charcoal coat with no security team, no assistants, no polished billionaire image surrounding him this time. Just Ethan. Tired eyes, windblown hair, vulnerability written openly across his face. Claire looked back toward the studio window in disbelief. What is this? Ethan stepped closer carefully. You once told me your dream was opening a creative space where young designers who could not afford connections still had a chance. Claire swallowed hard because she remembered that conversation perfectly. 3 years ago, 2 in the morning. Cheap takeout cartons spread across Ethan's tiny apartment floor while they talked about futures neither of them fully believed would happen. Ethan looked at her quietly now. You spent years helping me build my dream, he said softly. I realized nobody ever helped build yours. Claire felt emotion rise painfully inside her chest while city lights flickered softly around them. Ethan, I am not asking you to take me back tonight, he interrupted gently. I know I have not earned that. His voice lowered. But I needed to finally do one thing that was about you instead of my image. Claire looked through the studio windows again at the space that somehow looked exactly like something she once described half-jokingly years ago. Warm lighting, open tables, a small coffee corner near the back. Her chest tightened so hard it almost hurt to breathe. Because for the first time since losing him, Ethan was no longer trying to impress the world. He was finally trying to understand the woman he broke. Claire stood inside the studio long after Ethan left that night. Soft overhead lights glowed across unfinished desks and exposed brick walls while the faint scent of fresh paint still lingered in the air. Everything about the space felt strangely personal. Not expensive in the cold, polished way Ethan's world usually looked. Thoughtful instead. Warm. Human. Claire walked slowly toward the back wall, where framed sketches and branding concepts were pinned carefully beneath soft lighting. Her sketches. Early designs she had forgotten existed. Ideas she created years ago while sitting on apartment floors beside Ethan eating takeout. Noodles and dreaming about futures neither of them thought would actually happen. One small note near the corner made her chest tighten instantly. The first person who believed I could build something worth staying for. Ethan's handwriting. Claire closed her eyes briefly as emotion hit her all at once. For so long, she thought Ethan had erased her from his story completely. But standing here now, surrounded by proof that he carried pieces of her through every version of his success, she finally understood something painful. He had loved her. Truly. He had just also been weak enough to lose himself when the world started rewarding the wrong parts of him. Over the next month, Claire threw herself into building the studio properly. At first she told herself she was only doing it because the opportunity mattered. Because independent artists deserved affordable creative space in New York. Because walking away from her dream out of pride would only punish herself in the end. But deep down, she knew the truth was more complicated than that. Ethan stayed involved quietly without pushing her. He never showed up unexpectedly again. Never pressured her for another chance. Instead, he sent furniture samples for approval. Connected her with small business lawyers. Paid for internships for young designers from low-income neighborhoods after Claire casually mentioned how hard it was breaking into creative industries without connections. Little by little, she noticed something changing in him too. The billionaire image that once consumed his entire identity seemed to be fading. Ethan stopped appearing constantly in tabloids and business magazines. He stepped down from several social boards his mother pushed him into years ago. Rumors spread online that he had become less ambitious, which almost made Claire laugh because for the first time since she met him, Ethan actually seemed peaceful. One rainy Thursday evening, Claire stayed late at the studio organizing presentation boards while jazz music played softly from her laptop near the coffee counter. She barely noticed Ethan enter until his voice drifted gently across the room. You still work too hard when you are nervous. Claire looked up from the desk instinctively. Ethan stood near the entrance holding 2 paper coffee cups, while rainwater darkened the shoulders of his coat. Something inside her softened painfully at the sight. Some habits of love never fully disappeared. Ethan walked over carefully and placed 1 coffee beside her. Oat milk. 2 sugars. Claire looked at the cup quietly. You remembered. Ethan smiled faintly. I remember everything about you. God. Even now, he could still do that to her. Claire looked away quickly before he noticed the emotion in her eyes. For a while they worked in comfortable silence while rain tapped softly against the studio windows. It reminded Claire painfully of the early years before fame complicated everything between them. Back when loving Ethan felt simple instead of dangerous. Finally, Ethan set down the papers he was reviewing and looked at her carefully across the desk. "Can I ask you something?" Claire nodded slowly. Ethan's voice stayed soft. "Do you ever think we ruined the best thing that ever happened to us?" Claire stared down at the design sketches in front of her for a long moment before answering honestly. "I think you got scared." Ethan exhaled quietly like he had expected the answer. Claire finally looked up at him. "And I think I loved you so much that I started accepting things I never should have tolerated." Ethan's expression tightened painfully. "You deserved better than the version of me you got at the end." Claire swallowed hard. "Maybe." Silence settled between them again. Then Ethan reached into the inside pocket of his coat slowly. Claire's heartbeat immediately stumbled because for one terrifying second she thought he was pulling out another ring. Instead, he placed something much smaller onto the desk between them. The old subway card from years ago. Claire blinked in surprise. Ethan smiled faintly. "You dropped this the night we met that investor who told me to shut my company down." Claire picked it up carefully, stunned he still had it. Ethan looked down at the card thoughtfully. "You know what I remember most about that night?" Claire shook her head slightly. "You looked at me on that train like failing would not make me unlovable." His voice roughened quietly. Nobody had ever done that before. Claire felt tears sting her eyes again. Ethan leaned forward slowly, his gaze locked on hers now. "I spent years chasing rooms full of people whose approval disappeared the second I disappointed them." He swallowed hard. "And somehow I walked away from the one person who loved me before I became somebody worth photographing." Claire's chest ached painfully hearing it. Ethan looked terrified now in a way billionaires almost never allowed themselves to look. Completely unguarded. "I am not asking you to forget what I did," he whispered. "I know trust does not magically come back because I regret losing you." He paused shakily. "But if there is even the smallest part of you that still believes we could build something honest again, I will spend the rest of my life proving you were never second choice to me." Claire stared at him while rain blurred the city lights outside the windows. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then slowly, carefully, Claire walked around the desk toward him. Ethan looked almost afraid to breathe. She stopped directly in front of him beneath the warm studio lights and studied the man she once loved before money, power, and fear turned him into someone else. But now, for the first time in years, Ethan looked like himself again. Claire reached up gently and touched the side of his face. Ethan closed his eyes briefly at the contact like he had been starving for it. Tears burned behind Claire's eyes as she whispered the truth that had taken her so long to understand. "The saddest part was never losing you to my sister." Ethan opened his eyes slowly. Claire's voice trembled softly. "It was believing I had to compete for a love that should have protected me in the first place." Ethan looked shattered hearing that. But this time, instead of looking away from the damage he caused, he stayed there and faced it. And somehow, that finally felt like the beginning of something real.